Uncle Jeremy's Household. Part 2. Chapter 5. For some days after the interview in which Miss Warrender confessed her hatred of the secretary, things ran smoothly at Dunkelthwaite. I had several long conversations with her as we rambled about the woods and fields with the two little children, but I was never able to bring her round to the subject of her outburst in the library, nor did she tell me anything which threw any light at all upon the problem which interested me so deeply. Whenever I made any remark which might lead in that direction, she either answered me in a guarded manner, or else discovered suddenly that it was high time that the children were back in their nursery, so that I came to despair of ever learning anything from her lips. During this time I studied spasmodically and irregularly. Occasionally old Uncle Jeremy would shuffle into my room with a roll of manuscript in his hand, and would read me extracts from his great epic poem. Whenever I felt in need of company, I used to go a-visiting to John's laboratory, and he in his turn would come to my chamber if he were lonely. Sometimes I used to vary the monotony of my studies by taking my books out into an arbour in the shrubbery, and working there during the day. As to Copperthorne, I avoided him as much as possible, and he, for his part, appeared to be by no means anxious to cultivate my acquaintance. One day about the second week in June, John came to me with a telegram in his hand and look of considerable disgust upon his face. "Here's a pretty go," he cried. "The governor wants me to go up at once and meet him in London. It's some legal business, I suppose. He was always threatening to set his affairs in order, and now he's got an energetic fit and intends to do it." "I suppose you won't be gone long," I said. "A week or two, perhaps. It's rather a nuisance, just when I was in a fair way towards separating that alkaloid." "You'll find it there when you come back," I said, laughing. "There's no one here who is likely to separate it in your absence." "What bothers me most is leaving you here," he continued. "It seems such an inhospitable thing to ask a fellow down to a lonely place like this and then to run away and leave him." "Don't you mind about me," I answered. "I have too much to do to be lonely. Besides, I have found attractions in this place which I never expected. I don't think any 6 weeks of my life have ever passed more quickly than the last." "Oh, they passed quickly, did they?" said John, and sniggered to himself. I'm convinced that he was still under the delusion that I was hopelessly in love with the governess. He went off that day by the early train, promising to write and tell us his address in town, for he did not know yet at which hotel his father would put up. I little knew what a difference this trifle would make, nor what was to occur before I set eyes upon my friend once more. At the time I was by no means grieved at his departure. It brought the 4 of us who were left into closer apposition, and seemed to favour the solving of that problem, in which I found myself from day to day becoming more interested. About 1/4 of a mile from the house of Dunkelthwaite, there is a straggling little village of the same name, consisting of some 20 or 30 slate-roofed cottages, with an ivy-clad church hard by, and the inevitable beer-house. On the afternoon of the very day on which John left us, Miss Warrender and the 2 children walked down to the post-office there, and I volunteered to accompany them. Copperthorne would have liked well to have either prevented the excursion or to have gone with us, but fortunately Uncle Jeremy was in the throes of composition, and the services of his secretary were indispensable to him. It was a pleasant walk, I remember, for the road was well shaded by trees, and the birds were singing merrily overhead. We strolled along together, talking of many things, while the little boy and girl ran on laughing and romping. Before you get to the post office you have to pass the beer house already mentioned. As we walked down the village street, We became conscious that a small knot of people had assembled in front of this building. There were a dozen or so ragged boys and draggle-tailed girls, with a few bonnetless women, and a couple of loungers from the bar. Probably as large an assemblage as ever met together in the annals of that quiet neighbourhood. We could not see what it was that was exciting their curiosity, but the children scampered on and quickly returned, brimful of information. "Oh, Miss Warrender," Johnny cried as he dashed up, panting and eager, "there's a black man there like the ones you tell us stories about." "A gypsy, I suppose," I said. "No," said Johnny with decision. "He is blacker than that, isn't he, May?" "Blacker than that," the little girl echoed. "I suppose we had better go and see what this wonderful apparition is," I said. As I spoke, I glanced at my companion. To my surprise, she was very pale, and her great black eyes appeared to be luminous with suppressed excitement. "Aren't you well?" I asked. "Oh, yes, come on," she cried, eagerly quickening her step. "Come on." It was certainly a curious sight which met our eyes when we joined the little circle of rustics. It reminded me of the description of the opium-eating Malay, whom De Quincey saw in the farmhouse in Scotland. In the centre of the circle of homely Yorkshire folk, there stood an oriental wanderer, tall, lithe, and graceful, his linen clothes stained with dust, and his brown feet projecting through his rude shoes. It was evident that he had travelled far and long. He had a heavy stick in his hand on which he leaned, while his dark eyes looked thoughtfully away into space, careless apparently of the throng around him. His picturesque attire, with his coloured turban and swarthy face, had a strange and incongruous effect amongst all the prosaic surroundings. "Poor fellow," Miss Warrender said to me, speaking in an excited, gasping voice. "He is tired and hungry, no doubt, and cannot explain his wants. I will speak to him." And going up to the Indian, she said a few words in his native dialect. Never shall I forget the effect which those few syllables produced. Without a word, the wanderer fell straight down upon his face on the dusty road and absolutely grovelled at the feet of my companion. I had read of Eastern forms of abasement when in the presence of a superior, but I could not have imagined that any human could have expressed such abject humility as was indicated in this man's attitude. Miss Warrender spoke again in a sharp and commanding voice, on which he sprang to his feet and stood with his hands clasped and his eyes cast down, like a slave in the presence of his mistress. The little crowd, who seemed to think that the sudden prostration had been the prelude to some conjuring feat or acrobatic entertainment, looked on amused and interested. "Should you mind walking on with the children and posting the letters?" the governess said. "I should like to have a word with this man." I complied with her request, and when I returned in a few minutes, the two were still conversing. The Indian appeared to be giving a narrative of his adventures, or detailing the causes of his journey, for he spoke rapidly and excitedly, with quivering fingers and gleaming eyes. Miss Warrender listened intently, giving an occasional start or exclamation, which showed how deeply the man's statement interested her. "I must apologize for detaining you so long in the sun," she said, turning to me at last. "We must go home, or we shall be late for dinner." With a few parting sentences which sounded like commands, she left her dusky acquaintance still standing in the village street, and we strolled homewards with the children. "Well?" I asked, with natural curiosity, when we were out of earshot of the visitors. "Who is he? And what is he?" He comes from the central provinces, near the land of the Marathas. He is one of us. It has been quite a shock to me to meet a fellow countryman so unexpectedly. I feel quite upset." "It must have been pleasant for you," I remarked. "Yes, very pleasant," she said heartily. "And why did he fall down like that?" "Because he knew me to be the daughter of Achmet Genghis Khan," she said proudly. "And what chance has brought him here?" "Oh, it's a long story," she said carelessly. "He has led a wandering life. How dark it is in this avenue, and how the great branches shoot across. If you were to crouch on one of those, you could drop down on the back of anyone who passed, and they would never know that you were there until they felt your fingers on their throat." "What a horrible idea!" I exclaimed. "Gloomy places always give me gloomy thoughts," she said lightly. "By the way, I want you to do me a favour, Mr. Lawrence." "What is that?" I asked. "Don't say anything at the house about this poor compatriot of mine. They might think him a rogue and a vagabond, you know, and order him to be driven from the village." "I'm sure Mr. Thurston would do nothing so unkind." "No, but Mr. Copperthorne might." "Just as you like," I said. "But the children are sure to tell." "No, I think not," she answered. I don't know how she managed to curb their little prattling tongues, but they certainly preserved silence upon the point, and there was no talk that evening of the strange visitor who had wandered into our little hamlet. I had a shrewd suspicion that this stranger from the tropics was no chance wanderer, but had come to Dunkelthwaite upon some set errand. Next day I had the best possible evidence that he was still in the vicinity, for I met Miss Warrender coming down the garden walk, with a basket full of scraps of bread and of meat in her hand. She was in the habit of taking these leavings to sundry old women in the neighbourhood, so I offered to accompany her. "Is it old Dame Venables or old Dame Tailforth today?" I asked. "Neither one nor the other," she said with a smile. "I'll tell you the truth, Mr. Lawrence, because you have always been a good friend to me, and I feel I can trust you. These scraps are for my poor countryman. I'll hang the basket here on this branch, and he will get it." "Oh, he's still about, then?" I observed. "Yes, he's still in the neighbourhood." "You think he will find it?" "Oh, trust him for that," she said. "You don't blame me for helping him, do you? You would do the same if you lived among Indians and suddenly came upon an Englishman. Come to the hothouse and look at the flowers." We walked round to the conservatory together. When we came back, the basket was still hanging to the branch, but the contents were gone. She took it down with a laugh and carried it in with her. It seemed to me that since this interview with her countryman the day before, her spirits had become higher, and her step freer and more elastic. It may have been imagination, but it appeared to me also that she was not as constrained as usual in the presence of Copperthorne, and that she met his glances more fearlessly, and was less under the influence of his will. And now I am coming to that part of this statement of mine which describes how I first gained an insight into the relation which existed between those two strange mortals, and learned the terrible truth about Miss Warrender, or of the Princess Achmet Genghis, as I should prefer to call her, for assuredly she was the descendant of the fierce fanatical warrior, rather than of her gentle mother. To me the revelation came as a shock, the effect of which I can never forget. It is possible that in the way in which I have told the story, emphasizing those facts which had a bearing upon her, and omitting those which had not, my readers have already detected the strain which ran in her blood. As for myself, I solemnly aver that up to the last moment I had not the smallest suspicion of the truth. Little did I know what manner of woman this was, whose hand I pressed in friendship, and whose voice was music to my ears. Yet it is my belief, looking back, that she was really well disposed to me, and would not willingly have harmed me. It was in this manner that the revelation came about. I think I have mentioned that there was a certain arbour in the shrubbery in which I was accustomed to study during the daytime. One night, about 10 o'clock, I found, on going to my room, that I had left a book on gynecology in this summer-house, and as I intended to do a couple of hours' work before turning in, I started off with the intention of getting it. Uncle Jeremy and the servants had already gone to bed, so I slipped downstairs very quietly and turned the key gently in the front door. Once in the open air, I hurried rapidly across the lawn and so into the shrubbery, with the intention of regaining my property and returning as rapidly as possible. I had hardly passed the little wooden gate and entered the plantation before I heard the sound of talking, and knew that I had chanced to stumble upon one of those nocturnal conclaves which I had observed from my window. The voices were those of the secretary and of the governess, and it was clear to me, from the direction in which they sounded, that they were sitting in the arbour and conversing together without any suspicion of the presence of a third person. I have ever held that eavesdropping under any circumstances is a dishonourable practice, and, curious as I was to know what passed between these two, I was about to cough or give some other signal of my presence, when suddenly I heard some words of Copperthorne's, which brought me to a halt, with every faculty overwhelmed with horrified amazement. "They'll think he died of apoplexy," were the words which sounded clearly and distinctly through the peaceful air in the incisive tones of the amanuensis. I stood breathless, listening with all my ears. Every thought of announcing my presence had left me. What was the crime which these ill-assorted conspirators were hatching upon this lovely summer's night? I heard the deep, sweet tones of her voice, but she spoke so rapidly, and in such a subdued manner, that I could not catch the words. I could tell by the intonation that she was under the influence of deep emotion. I drew nearer, on tiptoe, with my ears straining to catch every sound. The moon was not up yet, and under the shadows of the trees it was very dark. There was little chance of my being observed. "Eaten his bread, indeed," the secretary said derisively. "You were not usually so squeamish. You did not think of that in the case of little Ethel." "I was mad, she ejaculated in a broken voice. "I prayed much to Buddha and to the great Boani, and it seemed to me that in this land of unbelievers it would be a great and glorious thing for me, a lonely woman, to act up to the teachings of my great father. There are few women who are admitted into the secrets of our faith, and it was but by an accident that the honour came upon me. Yet, having once had the path pointed out to me, I have walked straight and fearlessly, and the great Guru Ramdeen Singh has said that even in my 14th year I was worthy to sit upon the cloth of the Tupuni with the other Bhutotis. Yet I swear by the sacred pickaxe that I have grieved much over this. For what had the poor child done that she should be sacrificed?" "I fancy that my having caught you has had more to do with your repentance than the moral aspect of the case," Copperthorne said, with a sneer. "I may have had my misgivings before, but it was only when I saw you rising up with the handkerchief in your hand that I knew for certain that we were honoured by the presence of a princess of the thugs. An English scaffold would be rather a prosaic end for such a romantic being, and you have used your knowledge ever since to crush all the life out of me she said bitterly. "You have made my existence a burden to me." "A burden to you?" he said in an altered voice. "You know what my feelings are towards you. If I have occasionally governed you by the fear of exposure, it was only because I found you were insensible to the milder influence of love." "Love!" she cried bitterly. "How could I love a man who held a shameful death for ever before my eyes? But let us come to the point. You promise me my unconditional liberty if I do this one thing for you?" "Yes," Copperthorne answered. "You may go where you will when this is done. I shall forget what I saw here, in the shrubbery." "You swear it?" "Yes, I swear it." "I would do anything for my freedom," she said. "We can never have such a chance again," Copperthorne cried. "Young Thurston is gone, and this friend of his sleeps heavily and is too stupid to suspect. The will is made out in my favour, and if the old man dies, every stock and stone of the great estate will be mine." "Why don't you do it yourself, then?" she asked. "It's not in my line," he said. "Besides, I have not got the knack. That rumal, or whatever you call it, leaves no mark. That's the advantage of it. It is an accursed thing to slay one's benefactor, but it is a great thing to serve Bo-Ani, the goddess of murder. I know enough of your religion to know that. Would not your father do it if he were here?" "My father was the greatest of all the Borkers of Jubbulpore," she said proudly. "He has slain more than there are days in the year." "I wouldn't have met him for £1,000, Copperthorne remarked with a laugh. "But what would Achmet Genghis Khan say now, if he saw his daughter hesitate with such a chance before her of serving the gods?" "You have done excellently so far. He may well have smiled when the infant soul of young Ethel was wafted up to this god or ghoul of yours. Perhaps this is not the first sacrifice you have made. How about the daughter of this charitable German merchant? Ah, I see in your face that I am right again. After such deeds, you do wrong to hesitate now when there is no danger and all shall be made easy to you. Besides that, the deed will free you from your existence here, which cannot be particularly pleasant with a rope, so to speak, round your neck the whole time. If it is to be done, it must be done at once. He might rewrite his will at any moment, for he is fond of the lad, and is as changeable as a weathercock." There was a long pause, and a silence so profound that I seemed to hear my own heart throbbing in the darkness. "When shall it be done?" she asked at last. "Why not tomorrow night?" "How am I to get to him?" "I shall leave his door open," Copperthorne said. "He sleeps heavily, and I shall leave a night light burning, so that you may see your way." "And afterwards?" "Afterwards you will return to your room. In the morning it will be discovered that our poor employer has passed away in his sleep. It will also be found that he has left all his worldly goods as a slight return for the devoted labours of his faithful secretary. Then the services of Miss Warrender, the governess, being no longer required, she may go back to her beloved country, or to anywhere else that she fancies. She can run away with Mr. John Lawrence, student of medicine, if she pleases." "You insult me," she said angrily, and then, after a pause, "You must meet me tomorrow night before I do this." "Why so?" he asked. "Because there may be some last instructions which I may require." "Let it be here, then, at 12, he said. "No, not here. It is too near the house. Let us meet under the great oak at the head of the avenue." "Where you will," he answered sulkily. "But mind, I'm not going to be with you when you do it." "I shall not ask you," she said scornfully. "I think we have said all that need be said tonight." I heard the sound of one or other of them rising to their feet, and though they continued to talk, I did not stop to hear more, but crept quietly out from my place of concealment and scudded across the dark lawn. and in through the door, which I closed behind me. It was only when I had regained my room and had sunk back into my armchair that I was able to collect my scattered senses and to think over the terrible conversation to which I had listened. Long into the hours of the night I sat motionless, meditating over every word that I had heard, and endeavouring to form in my mind some plan of action for the future. Chapter 6. The Thugs. I had heard of the wild fanatics of that name, who are found in the central part of India, and whose distorted religion represents murder as being the highest and purest of all the gifts which a mortal can offer to the Creator. I remember an account of them, which I had read in the works of Colonel Meadows Taylor, of their secrecy, their organisation, their relentlessness, and the terrible power which their homicidal craze has over every other mental or moral faculty. I even recalled now that the rumal, a word which I had heard her mention more than once, was the sacred handkerchief with which they were wont to work their diabolical purpose. She was already a woman when she had left them, and being, according to her own account, the daughter of their principal leader, it was no wonder that the varnish of civilization had not eradicated all her early impressions, or prevented the breakout of occasional fits of fanaticism. In one of these, apparently, she had put an end to poor Ethel, having carefully prepared an alibi to conceal her crime, and it was Copperthorne's accidental discovery of this murder which gave him his power over his strange associate. Of all deaths, that by hanging is considered among these tribes to be the most impious and degrading, and her knowledge that she had subjected herself to this death by the law of the land was evidently the reason why she had found herself compelled to subject her will and tame her imperious nature when in the presence of the amanuensis. As to Copperthorne himself, as I thought over what he had done and what he proposed to do, a great horror and loathing filled my whole soul. Was this his return for the kindness lavished upon him by the poor old man? He had already cozened him into signing away his estates, and now, for fear some prickings of conscience should cause him to change his mind, he had determined to put it out of his power ever to write a codicil. All this was bad enough, but the acme of all seemed to be that, too cowardly to effect his purpose with his own hand, he had made use of this unfortunate woman's horrible conceptions of religion in order to remove Uncle Jeremy in such a way that no suspicion could possibly fall upon the real culprit. I determined in my mind that, come what might, the amanuensis should not escape from the punishment due to his crimes. But what was I to do? Had I known my friend's address, I should have telegraphed for him in the morning, and he could have been back in Dunkelthwaite before nightfall. Unfortunately, John was the worst of correspondents, and though he had been gone for some days, we had had no word yet of his whereabouts. There were 3 maidservants in the house, but no man, with the exception of old Elijah. Nor did I know of any upon whom I could rely in the neighbourhood. This, however, was a small matter, for I knew that in personal strength I was more than a match for the secretary, and I had confidence enough in myself to feel that my resistance alone would prevent any possibility of the plot being carried out. The question was, what were the best steps for me to take under the circumstances? My first impulse was to wait until morning, and then to quietly go or send to the nearest police station and summon a couple of constables. I could then hand Copperthorne and his female accomplice over to justice, and narrate the conversation which I had overheard. On second thoughts, this plan struck me as being a very impracticable one. What grain of evidence had I against them? Except my story, which, to people who did not know me, would certainly appear a very wild and improbable one. I could well imagine, too, the plausible voice and imperturbable manner with which Copperthorne would oppose the accusation, and how he would dilate upon the ill will which I bore both him and his companion on account of their mutual affection. How easy it would be for him to make a third person believe that I was trumping up a story in the hope of injuring a rival, and how difficult for me to make anyone credit that this clerical-looking gentleman and this stylishly dressed young lady were two beasts of prey who were hunting in couples. I felt that it would be a great mistake for me to show my hand before I was sure of the game. The alternative was to say nothing, and to let things take their course, being always ready to step in when the evidence against the conspirators appeared to be conclusive. This was the course which recommended itself to my young, adventurous disposition, and it also appeared to be the one most likely to lead to conclusive results. When at last, at early dawn, I stretched myself upon my bed, I had fully made up my mind to retain my knowledge in my own breast, and to trust to myself entirely for the defeat of the murderous plot which I had overheard. Old Uncle Jeremy was in high spirits next morning after breakfast, and insisted upon reading aloud a scene from Shelley's Cenci, a work for which he had a profound admiration. Copperthorne sat silent and inscrutable by his side, save when he threw in a suggestion or uttered an exclamation of admiration. Miss Warrender appeared to be lost in thought, and it seemed to me more than once that I saw tears in her dark eyes. It was strange for me to watch the three of them, and to think of the real relation in which they stood to each other. My heart warmed towards my little red-faced host with the quaint headgear and the old-fashioned ways. I vowed to myself that no harm should befall him while I had power to prevent it. The day wore along slowly and drearily. It was impossible for me to settle down to work, so I wandered restlessly about the corridors of the old-fashioned house and over the garden. Copperthorne was with Uncle Jeremy upstairs, and I saw little of him. Twice, when I was striding up and down outside, I perceived the governess coming with the children in my direction, but on each occasion I avoided her by hurrying away. I felt that I could not speak to her without showing the intense horror with which she inspired me, and so betraying my knowledge of what had transpired the night before. She noticed that I shunned her, for at luncheon, when my eyes caught hers for a moment, she flashed across a surprised and injured glance, to which, however, I made no response. The afternoon post brought a letter from John telling us that he was stopping at the Langham. I knew that it was now impossible for him to be of any use to me in the way of sharing the responsibility of whatever might occur, but I nevertheless thought it my duty to telegraph him and let him know that his presence was desirable. This involved a long walk to the station, but that was useful as helping me to while away the time, and I felt a weight off my mind when I heard the clicking of the needles which told me that my message was flying upon its way. When I reached the avenue gate on my return from Ingleton, I found our old serving-man Elijah standing there, apparently in a violent passion. "They says as one rat brings others," he said to me, touching his hat, "and it seems as it be the same with they darkies." He had always disliked the governess on account of what he called her uppish ways. "What's the matter, then?" I asked. "It's one of they foreigners a-hiding and a-prowling," said the old man. "I seed him here among the bushes, and I sent him off wi' a bit o' my mind, looking after the hens as like as not, or maybe wanting to burn the house and murder us all in our beds. I'll go down to the village, Mr. Lawrence, and see what he's after." And he hurried away in a paroxysm of senile anger. This little incident made a considerable impression on me, and I thought seriously over it as I walked up the long avenue. It was clear that the wandering Hindu was still hanging about the premises. He was a factor whom I had forgotten to take into account. If his compatriot enlisted him as an accomplice in her dark plans, it was possible that the three of them might be too many for me. Still, it appeared to me to be improbable that she should do so, since she had taken such pains to conceal his presence from Copperthorne. I was half tempted to take Elijah into my confidence, but on second thoughts I came to the conclusion that a man of his age would be worse than useless as an ally. About 7 o'clock, I was going up to my room when I met the secretary, who asked me whether I could tell him where Miss Warrender was. I answered that I had not seen her. "It's a singular thing," he said, "that no one has seen her since dinner-time. The children don't know where she is. I particularly want to speak to her." He hurried on, with an agitated and disturbed expression upon his features. As to me, Miss Warrender's absence did not seem a matter of surprise. No doubt she was out in the shrubbery somewhere, nerving herself for the terrible piece of work which she had undertaken to do. I closed my door behind me and sat down, with a book in my hand, but with my mind too much excited to comprehend the contents. My plan of campaign had already formed. I determined to be within sight of their trysting place, to follow them, and to interfere at the moment when my interference would have most effect. I had chosen a thick, knobby stick, dear to my student heart, and with this I knew that I was master of the situation, for I had ascertained that Copperthorne had no firearms. I do not remember any period of my life when the hours passed so slowly as did those which I spent in my room that night. Far away, I heard the mellow tones of the Dunkelthwaite clock as it struck the hours of 8, and then of 9, and then, after an interminable pause, of 10. After that it seemed as though time had stopped altogether as I paced my little room, fearing and yet longing for the hour, as men will when some great ordeal has to be faced. All things have an end, however, and at last there came pealing through the still night air the first clear stroke which announced the 11th hour. Then I rose, and, putting on my soft slippers, I seized my stick and slipped quietly out of my room and down the creaking old-fashioned staircase. I could hear the stertorous snoring of Uncle Jeremy upon the floor above. I managed to feel my way to the door through the darkness, and having opened it, passed out into the beautiful starlit night. I had to be very careful of my movements, because the moon shone so brightly that it was almost as light as day. I hugged the shadow of the house until I reached the garden hedge, and then, crawling down in its shelter, I found myself safe in the shrubbery in which I had been the night before. Through this I made my way, treading very cautiously and gingerly, so that not a stick snapped beneath my feet. In this way I advanced until I found myself among the brushwood at the edge of the plantation, and within full view of the great oak tree which stood at the upper end of the avenue. There was someone standing under the shadow of the oak. At first I could hardly make out who it was, but presently the figure began to move, and, coming out into a silvery patch where the moon shone down between two branches, looked impatiently to left and to right. Then I saw that it was Copperthorne, who was waiting alone. The governess apparently had not yet kept her appointment. As I wished to hear, as well as to see, I wormed my way along under the dark shadows of the trunks in the direction of the oak. When I stopped, I was not more than 15 paces from the spot where the tall, gaunt figure of the amanuensis looked grim and ghastly in the shifting light. He paced about uneasily, now disappearing in the shadow, now reappearing in the silvery patches where the moon broke through the covering above him. It was evident from his movements that he was puzzled and disconcerted at the non-appearance of his accomplice. Finally, he stationed himself under a great branch which concealed his figure, while from beneath it he commanded a view of the gravel drive which led down from the house, and along which, no doubt, he expected Miss Warrender to come. I was still lying in my hiding-place, congratulating myself inwardly at having gained a point from which I could hear all without risk of discovery, when my eye lit suddenly upon something which made my heart rise to my mouth, and almost caused me to utter an ejaculation which would have betrayed my presence. I have said that Copperthorne was standing immediately under one of the great branches of the oak tree. Beneath this, all was plunged in the deepest shadow. But the upper part of the branch itself was silvered over by the light of the moon. As I gazed, I became conscious that down this luminous branch something was crawling, a flickering, inchoate something almost indistinguishable from the branch itself, and yet slowly and steadily writhing its way down it. My eyes, as I looked, became more accustomed to the light. And then this indefinite something took form and substance. It was a human being, a man, the Indian whom I had seen in the village. With his arms and legs twined round the great limb, he was shuffling his way down as silently and almost as rapidly as one of his native snakes. Before I had time to conjecture the meaning of his presence, he was directly over the spot where the secretary stood, his bronzed body showing out hard and clear against the disk of the moon behind him. I saw him take something from round his waist, hesitate for a moment, as though judging his distance, and then spring downwards, crashing through the intervening foliage. There was a heavy thud, as of two bodies falling together, and then there rose on the night air a noise as of someone gargling his throat, followed by a succession of croaking sounds, the remembrance of which will haunt me to my dying day. Whilst this tragedy had been enacted before my eyes, its entire unexpectedness and its horror had bereft me of the power of acting in any way. Only those who have been in a similar position can imagine the utter paralysis of mind and body which comes upon a man in such straits, and prevents him from doing the 1,001 things which may be suggested afterwards as having been appropriate to the occasion. When those notes of death, however, reached my ears, I shook off my lethargy and ran forward with a loud cry from my place of concealment. At the sound, the young thug sprang from his victim with a snarl like a wild beast driven from a carcass, and made off down the avenue at such a pace that I felt it to be impossible for me to overtake him. I ran to the secretary and raised his head. His face was purple and horribly distorted. I loosened his shirt collar and did all I could to restore him, but it was useless. The rumal had done its work, and he was dead. I have little more to add to this strange tale of mine. If I have been somewhat long-winded in the telling of it, I feel that I owe no apology for that, for I have simply set these successive events down in a plain, unvarnished fashion, and the narrative would be incomplete without any one of them. It transpired afterwards that Miss Warrender had caught the 7:20 London train and was safe in the metropolis before any search could be made for her. As to the messenger of death whom she had left behind to keep her appointment with Copperthorne under the old oak tree, he was never either heard of or seen again. There was a hue and cry over the whole countryside, but nothing came of it. No doubt the fugitive passed the days in sheltered places and travelled rapidly at night, living on such scraps as can sustain an Oriental, until he was out of danger. John Thornton returned next day, and I poured all the facts into his astonished ears. He agreed with me that it was best, perhaps, not to speak of what I knew concerning Copperthorne's plans, and the reasons which kept him out so late upon that summer's night. Thus even the county police have never known the full story of that strange tragedy, and they certainly never shall, unless indeed the eyes of some of them should chance to fall upon this narrative. Poor Uncle Jeremy mourned the loss of his secretary for months, and many were the verses which he poured forth in the form of epitaphs and of in memoriam poems. He has been gathered to his fathers himself since then, and the greater part of his estate has, I'm glad to say, descended to the rightful heir, his nephew. There is only one point on which I should like to make a remark. How was it that the wandering thug came to Dunkelthwaite? This question has never been cleared up, but I have not the slightest doubt in my own mind, nor I think can anyone who considers the facts of the case, that there was no chance about his appearance. The sect in India were a large and powerful body, and when they came to look around for a fresh leader, they naturally bethought them of the beautiful daughter of their late chief. It would be no difficult matter to trace her to Calcutta, to Germany, and finally to Dunkelthwaite. He had come, no doubt, with the message that she was not forgotten in India, and that a warm welcome awaited her if she chose to join her scattered tribesmen. This may seem far-fetched, but it is the opinion which I have always entertained upon the matter. I began this statement by a quotation from a letter, and I shall end it by one. This was from an old friend, Dr. B.C. Haller, a man of encyclopedic knowledge, and particularly well versed in Indian manners and customs. It is through his kindness that I am able to reproduce the various native words which I heard from time to time from the lips of Miss Warrender, but which I should not have been able to recall to my memory had he not suggested them to me. This is a letter in which he comments upon the matter, which I had mentioned to him in conversation some time previously. My dear Lawrence, I promised to write to you Thuggee, but my time has been so occupied that it is only now that I can redeem my pledge. I was much interested in your unique experience, and should much like to have further talk with you upon the subject. I may inform you that it is most unusual for a woman to be initiated into the mysteries of Thuggee, and it arose in this case probably from her having accidentally or by design tasted the sacred gur, which was the sacrifice offered by the gang after each murder. Anyone doing this must become an acting thug, whatever the rank, sex, or condition. Being of noble blood, she would then rapidly pass through the different grades of Tilai, or scout, Lugai, or gravedigger, Shumshia, or holder of the victim's hands, and finally of Butoti, or strangler. In all this she would be instructed by her guru, or spiritual adviser, whom she mentions in your account as having been her own father, who was a Borka, or an expert thug. Having once attained this position, I do not wonder that her fanatical instincts broke out at times. The pilau, which she mentions in one place, was the omen on the left hand, which, if it is followed by the tibau, or omen on the right, was considered to be an indication that all would go well. By the way, you mentioned that the old coachman saw the Hindu lurking about among the bushes in the morning. Do you know what he was doing? I am very much mistaken if he was not digging Copperthorne's grave, for it is quite opposed to thug customs to kill a man without having some receptacle prepared for his body. As far as I know, only one English officer in India has ever fallen a victim to the fraternity, and that was Lieutenant Monsell in 1812. Since then, Colonel Sleeman has stamped it out to a great extent, though it is unquestionable that it flourishes far more than the authorities suppose. Truly, the dark places of the earth are full of cruelty, and nothing but the gospel will ever effectually dispel that darkness. You are very welcome to publish these few remarks, if they seem to you to throw any light upon your narrative. Yours very sincerely, B.C. Haller. That is the end of Uncle Jeremy's Household by Arthur Conan Doyle. Read by Greg Wagland for Magpie Audio, 2020. Thank you for listening.